of veggies in containers. And you can see my old watering can there, and kind of an old beat up container on the right. Got some flowers in there, but also some veggies. And again, when we're talking about this time of the season about planting outdoors, there are a lot of plants that can grow outside in this weather and in containers. Anything anything that we could grow out in the ground for the garden, we could do in a container if we had the container that was the right size for the plants. So the first thing to know about any container, it's got to have some kind of drainage. All right, there we go. Oops, if I can make this change. There we go. So drainage is everything. Now I always prefer on the left there to have something that I can drill holes in. The version on the right, sometimes we use, gravel. Sometimes we use styrofoam peanuts. Sometimes we use broken up pots like this. But in the last 3 seasons, we have had so much rain that if there's no drainage in that pot, there's going to be so much water in there that you're going to get root rot, and the plant is not going to be able to survive. And so even if you have a ceramic container, if you have somebody that's handy with the right type of drill bit, they can drill a hole in that without ruining it, without cracking it. And when possible, always trying to have drainage in your containers, and especially in the last 3 seasons have been so wet. So bigger is usually better when it comes to containers. Of course, that one would be hard to move. But the reason we want bigger containers is the more mass there is, as far as soil is concerned, the less you have to water. Containers are always a great idea early in the season like this. We've got 6 days of off and on rain coming up. You won't have any problem with your containers. They'll have all the water they need. But when we get to July and August, and if we don't get rain, that's when you're going to be like, oh, geez, I have so much watering to do on these containers. And so always trying to look for a bigger container. I'm also going to talk a little bit about self-watering containers when we get going, and I like those a lot. And there's a lot of different types of self-watering containers. So I got a question here. Oh, that's a private question. So I hope it's okay if I answer this. What herbs can I grow in my half-barrel planters, which I grow tomatoes in? And yes, Jane, most containers already have holes in them. It's just every once in a while we come up to one where it might be a container that we have that we're going to now use it for growing, and it wasn't made to have those holes in there. Yeah, so almost 99% of all containers that you'll buy at a nursery will already have drainage holes in them. So that's something we don't have to worry about. And Bill, I'm going to be talking about herbs as we get going here. I've got a lot to talk about herbs because I love growing herbs, and that's a perfect size container too, Bill. Those half barrel planters. That's also a good size for a tomato. So there's a basic formula with containers. When you think of it as far as flowers, these are vegetables here, except for the pansies, but pansies are edibles. We add them to the salad. But the thriller is the big plant in the middle. Then a filler is smaller plants around the outside, and then a spiller goes off the edge. So in the case of vegetables, it might be depending on the size of the container, a tomato in the center or a pepper in the center, then something shorter, like some lettuce or other greens, and then over the sides, some kind of vine crop like cucumbers or a squash or that sort of thing. But we'll talk a lot about the different vegetables and how they do in containers. So the first thing to know is that anything can be a container, and this is one of the fun things about being a container gardener. Now, since my radio show's on Sundays at 7 a.m., I'm followed by the guys from Coons Market. And so when the Coons Market and I were together and I showed this picture of the shopping cart. They were like, "Don't show that picture. We don't want people stealing our shopping carts." And I said, "Yes, I understand that, but this is just an old one that someone found somewhere. They turned into a container." That one on the far right there, that was in Italy. And again, these little teapots make great containers, but can you imagine how often that little thing is going to need to be watered? I have a little copper teapot that I use for growing things in, but it has to be something really small uh, to work because again, you how often can you be watering? So this is something I've had around the house since 1983. This garden cart was a gift from a dear friend of ours who's since passed away. Betty sold us our first house in 1983, and she gave me this garden cart. And you can see, it's been beat on. It's been out in the garden, but about 3 or 4 years ago, I painted it white and put those little stencils on there. It was fun to do, and I just can't. I don't have the heart to throw it away. So you can see how well those greens are doing. And then a friend of mine, he works in this factory. They were redoing the factory, and they were redoing the whole lighting system. And he had all these light diffusers, and I'm using those to keep plants like this. These greens, no matter how cold it gets, even like 2 nights ago when it got really cold, they would be fine. But with a little bit of protection like this, they all thrive, and you can see they're just going crazy. In fact, I got to get out there and do some harvesting. When you're growing greens like this in a container, you can just take scissors and trim them off, and then they're going to come back again, and then maybe even again. And if you look at those weeds down at the bottom, that's garlic mustard, and garlic mustard is actually an edible weed. Now, anytime that I talk about foraging, you have to know what it is before you put it in your mouth. And so learn what garlic mustard is. But I make garlic mustard pesto out of that weed, and it's really good. And I'm sure my recipe is out there somewhere. I made a video. Here's a couple more ideas for containers. When you have stuff that you either can get from Construction Junction or you don't want to throw away, I did that trick over there with the log. I have a log up in a orchard area, and it was pretty well hollowed out. But I took a chainsaw and got it a little bit more hollowed out, and it's in an area that is fenced in from the deer, so they can't get into the orchard. And so I filled the whole thing up with annual flowers, and that is on the trail where my wife walks the dogs. And so she was up there, and she was just like, "Did you see what happened up there?" I said, "No, what happened?" "There's all these flowers in the log." I said, "Oh boy, the birds must have dropped the seeds in there." But I told her the truth. Here's a couple other things. Bathtubs make great containers. They already have the drainage in them. I have a clawfoot tub I'd love to make into a water garden, but my wife says no, that someday I'm going to have to actually plumb it up and put it into the basement. And here's the ultimate classic container. Oh, is that a beauty? Look at that row of them on the bottom there. That'd be a good place to grow some greens, huh? But I do find a lot of containers at thrift stores and at yard sales and that sort of thing because a lot of people don't think of containers the same way we do. They don't think that it's a big deal, but you can find stuff like this all over the place. And every one of those ones on the left there and the right would all have drainage already in them. And look at how beautiful they are. And a lot of times you can find them for a song. So don't limit yourself when it comes to containers. Look around. If you don't want to leave the property, look around and see if there's something you can turn into a container. I love doing that. Not everybody in the household appreciates it, but okay. So Deborah, those containers on the right, that was in France actually, at a garden called Luxembourg Gardens, and my wife asked the same question: "What are you taking a picture of?" And no public garden left in the USA would have all these old clay pots like that. And so that's like thousands of little clay pots. And this was right around Christmas time, where with their climate means that you could still be planting pansies, English daisies, primroses, stuff like that love cool weather. So that's from Luxembourg Gardens. So don't limit yourself to your containers. Find some really cool container Whether, in my case, my wife gave me a wheelbarrow when we first started again, the early 80s, I started gardening and it finally bit the dust, but again, I could not stand to throw it away. And so I made it into a container, grow stuff in it in my, in one of my garden beds. So what do we fill up those containers with? Some kind of good mix like this. I've had great luck with this stuff, bumper crop, and you can only buy it at a local nursery. And but there are many, many, many different mixes. The thing is, you want to use something that's lightweight. You don't want to dig garden soil out and throw it into your container. You want this light mix. Actually, a lot of times for my containers, even to save more money, I'll buy a big bag of the bumper crop, either the potting mix or the soil builder, and I'll mix it with some free compost that I'm getting from the municipality. It lightens up the compost, and I can stretch it out a little bit longer. The trick to filling up a container with this type of mix is to get the mix wet first. And so I have a big plastic, what they call trug, a TRUG. And I'll throw some mix in there. I'll throw a little water in. I'll mix it up. And as I said last week, to get to the exact consistency you want it to be perfect for growing plants in, is you'll squeeze it together. And if it sticks together but doesn't drip, it is absolutely perfect. And what people do a lot of times when they just start container gardening is they'll throw in a dry mix, they'll put some seeds or plants in, and then they'll try and add water, and it just the mix doesn't accept the water as readily. When you've got it in another container and you're mixing it up with your hands and you're getting it right to where you want to get it, that's just the best way to do it. Anytime you're using a planting mix for seeds, containers, whatever, always get it wet first. So here's our first look at an herb garden, and boy, herbs just love containers. And you can really pack them in there tight if you want to. If you look at some of these pictures, the one container I've got there, the gray one, that's just one big basil plant. But there's a few others there where you know, there most of them are Mediterranean plants, and they like it dry, and they don't mind being crowded together. Uh, my favorite thing in an herb garden or in a container is basil. I can't get enough of basil. To me, when you brush your hands across basil, that is the aroma of summer. And so, even the same as in the garden is in a container, I'll be planting basil maybe 3 times a year, because as it gets older, a lot of times it'll start to go to seed, and it doesn't mean that the flavor is bad. It just means the flavor is different. Um, it reminds me, there is a brand new basil coming out this year that I'm really excited about, and it's called Everleaf Emerald Towers. Let me type that in here. Basil, Everleaf Emerald Towers, and a bunch of the nurseries that I work with, I told them about this basil because I was at this trade show in Baltimore. Actually, no, this was the trade show in Columbus, and I ran into a gardening friend that was got some of the seeds a year early to trial, and she grew it against 12 different other basils and did a blind taste test uh, with heirloom tomatoes. And everyone that did the test loved the Everleaf Emerald Towers the best because of its texture. It has this real light texture and great flavor. It is basil downy mildew resistant. That's been a problem for us the last few seasons with these wet years. They get a fungal issue, and they'll start to kind of turn brown and black, and then you got to start again. But it's resistant to the disease, and the Everleaf name means that it's very resistant to flowering, and so it will stay real leafy. Like I said, any plant when it goes to flower, it changes the flavor of the leaf. And that's certainly true with basil. And again, I eat lots of basil after it's flowered. I eat the basil flowers, but it's different than the basil that hasn't flowered. So there's a couple different ways to do this. You could get a big container like that. That's a pretty one. You know, and look at how tightly those are packed in there. There's a basil on the right. There's some mint in there. Some. I don't know what this means, but somebody's requesting to annotate the shared content. So I don't know what that means. I'm declining that, but I hope I'm not messing you up there, Craig. Uh, we're still learning. At least I am, as an old person, learning how to run these. And so you can do it like this: one big container. Like we talked about, that half barrel would be perfect. You just fill that thing up with herbs. And the thing is, you're not going to want to bring in a stone container like that. But I'll show you when we get going here in a couple more slides that at the end of the season we can bring those in. But if you didn't want to do it that way, you could do a couple pots. I love to have these pots outside the kitchen, close to where I'm cooking, so I can grab them. Uh, you know, again, you're only limited by your imagination when it comes to this stuff, as far as what you want to grow and where you want to grow it. Uh, and then at the end of the season, bring in your herbs and you can put them with other plants. They'll limp along during the winter. I actually saw a young couple today that we were on a Zoom together, and they were showing me that they had all this really beautiful looking basil and I'm trying to think what else, rosemary that they were worried about because it was, they've been inside the whole winter and they were really tall and kind of leggy, and I said that's just what they do. So Alice, where can we purchase this in the North Hills area? So any good nursery, Han, Sorgels, Best Feeds. We always say that the best nursery is the one that's closest to your house. And speaking of houses, look at these containers. Now that's a building that loves containers. I forget where that was. It's somewhere in Europe. We're on one of my trips. So we got a question: if you bring herbs in over the winter and then want to take them outside, should you replant? Well, you don't have to. Uh, Usually, what I do is, the herbs, they aren't heavy feeders, and so that's a good segue there, Deborah, to this next slide. I showed this last week. This is the stuff that I'm using to feed all my containers, and I've got some tomato plants out there from that I bought at Chapin's like a month and a half ago in an unheated greenhouse, and feeding them this stuff, it gives them everything they need, and so you could repot if you would want to, but if you feed them over the summer, they should be fine. Now that'll be about it. Then you'll want to repot for sure after that. So it doesn't have to be this specific fertilizer. There's lots of organic fertilizers that are sold this way. It's a concentrate where, again, you get this one bottle for 12, 15 bucks, whatever it is, and you just mix a couple tablespoons in every gallon. Now, I always like to say that I've been using this kind of fertilizer for 30 years, and back in the day, it smelled like fish often. Now, with modern technology, it smells like minty fish. So, not quite as bad, but my wife knows when I've used this on the indoor plants. I have a giant table of indoor plants, and this is the time to fertilize them. We're getting a lot of longer days, and so they can use the fertilizer. And I often get questions when to water. And my friend Frank Peasy, who used to be the horticulturist at the zoo, he said, "You've got 10 digits that you can use as your water testers." And I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "I'll just take your finger and stick it down in the container. And if it's dry, it needs water. If it's wet, you wait." I also learned from him, I'll go back to this, that every time that they're watering their containers at the zoo, and they have the most beautiful containers, uh, they're adding a little bit of fertilizer in that June to August period where you've got those really, really long days. Uh, they're they're adding fertilizer every time they water, and so that has helped my containers out a lot because I was only doing it maybe once a month. And so after he taught me that, when we get to that what we call high season, those long days, I'm just adding a little bit of this grow every time I water. And you know, they can be pretty. I showed this one slide last week, the violas and the freckles lettuce, but there's so many beautiful plants. And one of the trends in the last several years has been to have ornamental edibles. And so that means replanting. And we talked about it last week, succession planting. That container on the right with that, it's called red sales lettuce there. I'll harvest it a couple times. It'll be done. And something else will go in there, either veggies or flowers, something. And that's just part of, for me, the fun part of gardening, to keep planting. Uh, and boy, I just tell you, I just love the combination, because the pansies and violas love it cool. The lettuce loves it cool. That lettuce can live outside right now along with the pansies, and they make just a great mixture. They are both edible, but as I said last week, you want to eat the flower, not the stem, because the stem is bitter. All right, growing tomatoes in containers, and believe it or not, that is a giant container at Shadyside Hospital. And what they're doing there is just wonderful. They have this beautiful garden, uh, and they're using all the produce in their kitchen for patients. So the most important thing about growing tomatoes in containers is first choosing the right type of tomato. And so there's lots of tomatoes that are bred specifically for container growing. One of my favorites, I'm going to type it in here, is called Superbush. And it's usually pretty easy to find. The thing I like about it, oops, is that the tomatoes are good sized. You know, as you see that picture right there, that's your typical patio tomato. And you can see that they're usually kind of small like cherries, or maybe a little bit bigger as what we call saladette tomatoes. I've had great luck with Superbush because it just stays short and squatty, but puts on some decent sized tomatoes. If you're going to grow a normal tomato, a 6 foot tall tomato plant, you're going to need at least 15 gallons. And you see these big fiber pots. I'm going to talk a little bit about fiber pots in just a bit, but you need a lot of mass, because the thing about tomatoes is, if that soil does not stay evenly moist, you could go through the whole season of growing this tomato, and if it dries out and it can't get the calcium it needs, the calcium is in the soil, but without water, it can't uptake that calcium. Then you're going to get this thing called blossom end rot, and it's awful, because at the bottom of your tomato, it kind of turns blackish. That can heal, and subsequent tomatoes that are up taller on the plant, if you see the problem, you can start properly watering, and you won't get the blossom end rot. But I highly recommend for anyone growing tomatoes to try what we call self-watering containers. These are called earth boxes, and I've got a cutaway here that shows in that size box. Now they're a little pricey; they're probably $50, but in that box you can do two full-size tomatoes, probably 3 or 4 peppers. I mean, one box you're getting your 2 tomatoes. Another box, maybe 3 or 4 peppers. And so they're pretty cool. And this is how it works. And this is how all self-watering containers work. So down below, you can see there's a reservoir. And as long as there's water in that reservoir, the soil will call for it when it needs it. And you can see there's a little tube in there. You just use that like you're checking oil. You're putting a little dipstick down in there. And as long as you got water in there, you'll never have to worry about your tomatoes getting blossom end rot, because the soil will stay evenly moist. Now, if you're good with making stuff on your own, you could make one. And this is how you do it. It's basically just a shelf that is porous, and you can see a little tube in there for checking the water. The soil would go on top of this. Then you would put your plants in, and usually they put some kind of cover on there so that you're not getting excess rain in there. You want to control the water. And in my opinion, I've made some of these out of big Rubbermaid containers as opposed to they'd be twice the size of an earth box. And again, I'm thinking along the lines of once that mass gets warmed up, it's fine, but also it doesn't need as much refilling of the water. So if you were to have 4 tomatoes in that one that's twice as big, and you were going on vacation, you could fill that thing up with water and be on your way, and you'd be good to go. Now, I've been growing a lot in these lately. The advantage of a grow bag, first, you've got a black grow bag for tomatoes that sucks the heat. And you can see they're using red mulch on top of it. There's something about red that tomatoes like when the sun is reflecting off the red, but the black is getting hot, and that's what tomatoes and peppers love. Hot, hot, hot. The advantage of a grow bag is that when you do empty it, you can store it flat. They're lightweight, and when you grow something in a grow bag, it does a thing called self pruning of the roots. In a normal container, the roots will just circle each other, but in a fiber pot like this, they don't. They'll just go out to the edge, and that's it. They're just waiting. It's called air pruning, and I'm using a lot of them. They're very inexpensive. Like there's one called Root Pouch. I'll put that on here. It's made out of uh, water bottles, so it's a good thing. And like for a 15-gallon one, and it has handles on it, they're like under $8. And so they're they're pretty thick and pretty tough, and they're mine have lasted for years. And so I think it's a great way to add some plants to the garden if you don't have a lot of space. So here's some beans in a container. Again, right container for the right size plant. That's probably about 8 or 9, maybe 10 gallons tops, but you don't need 15 gallons for bush beans. You could also do pole beans and something like this with support. I like pole beans a lot because they they come a little later, but they're easier to pick and they make more. They'll make tons and tons of beans. The other advantage of growing a lot of these vegetables in containers, especially something like beans or lettuce or peas that rabbits love. Now, this one they could get to, but I've got some that are up a little higher that the rabbits just can't get to it. And Deborah, no, there's no inside container in those grow bags. It's just the grow bag, and and it works. You can see them at any garden center. In fact, at Han Nursery, I'm working with them. They have a 50-gallon fiber pot, and they want me to come up with a plan for what plants people could have in there for kind of a sort of an instant garden. I talked about this last week. I have a 200-gallon fiber pot that I filled last year with winter plants, lettuce, arugula, some kale, stuff like that, and it's still going strong. And I'll tell you what, of all the plants out there, peppers love to grow in containers, and especially hot peppers. This is one called Super Chili. If you like hot peppers, even just they're too hot for me to eat actually as just nibble on a hot pepper. I make hot pepper flakes out of them. But if you're looking for a hot pepper that is indestructible, that will put on peppers under any conditions, and I'm going to add that to the chat. I love Super Chili pepper. It was 1988. Oops, not 1888. 1988. All America selection. Whenever a plant has that on it, says AAS, All America selection. What's happened there is they've sent the seeds out to growers. They don't know what the variety is. They just know it's a hot pepper. They grow it against another similar hot pepper that was probably also an AAS winner. If it does better, the new one does better, and people from all over the country agree that it is better, it becomes an All America selection. So I've never gone wrong with All America selections. I grow a lot of them. So not just hot peppers, but green peppers will grow fine in containers too. Uh, it's just they like a lot of water and they like a lot of heat. So again, I'm usually for a pepper, I'm trying to do a pretty big container. Probably 5 gallons for each pepper would be what I would prefer. And when we're choosing things like vine crops like squash, there are all sorts of varieties. When you're looking for your seed, if you want to grow in containers, if you're looking for seeds, there are bush varieties like this. It doesn't vine as much. Now, I use vining crops in containers, and as I said, for the spiller, but that container has to be pretty big and it has to have lots of nutrients in it because these are heavy feeders. And so a bush zucchini is a good option in containers. Same when we go with something like cucumbers. There's a variety, real famous heirloom called Space Master, but you'll see them all. They'll be better bush. They'll be patio cucumber. They vine, but they don't vine as long as the normal ones in our garden. When you're growing them in your garden, uh, you have to be a vine wrangler. They will just go everywhere. So Bill has a question. What size root pouch do you suggest for tomatoes? I would say 15 gallons minimum. And that's just because of the blossom end rot. You want to be sure that that thing can stay moist. That's an important part of growing any of these plants. And you can see this cucumber here is in some type of fiber pot. They're becoming really popular, and I like growing in them. And actually, we talked a little bit about it last week about potatoes, but potatoes in a fiber pot would be great because you could just turn that whole fiber pot over and just dump them out. And you'd have all these potatoes. But potatoes are one of the easiest container plants. We talked about the hilling up. I have that slide again, but all we're doing is yes. There's another question. Can you use baskets as containers? Yes. Anything can be a container as long as it has drainage. Now, for the basket, you might get too much drainage. You might think about maybe putting some plastic along the inside edges, depending on when you water it, what happens. If it's all coming out of the sides, it's going to be a better idea just to run a little, plastic on the inside. I talked about it last week. I use 3 mil thick drop cloths from the hardware store for all sorts of projects. Usually for on top of the plants, it's a greenhouse, but that would also be something inexpensively that I could use to line the inside of that. And then I'd leave the bottom of the basket free of the plastic so it could drain. Let me finish this message. Again, that's kind of the fun part of the container thing is picking these different things and uh, finding things that you love to make into containers. I mean, I've made all sorts of stuff into containers. Again, I'm cheap, so it breaks my heart to throw something away. My parents are from the Depression era, and anything that I can save and put holes in the bottom, people have given me kitchen sinks, people have given me bathtubs, which we talked about, you know, just because I want to recycle it. I want to reuse these things. And so for the potatoes, what we do is we use good seed potatoes if we can. But again, I had a neighbor who would use just normal potatoes. He would cut them up, he would put them in a Ziploc bag until they started sprouting, and he would plant them. The advantage of a real seed potato from a nursery is that we know it's certified disease free. Potatoes, like tomatoes from the same family, are very susceptible to fungal diseases. And so I wouldn't want to use a normal potato. I would want to use technically what's a seed potato. They're inexpensive. You basically cut them in half, let them sit overnight, and then you leave room at the top of that container. You see there's 6, 8 inches at the top. I would probably leave more than that. But here's a slide from last week which shows what hilling up is. In our case, it would be in a container. And so we'd have probably 8 to 10 inches filled in the container halfway up. Put that potato in. As the greens grow, we just add more soil to the pot, and that will give us it will produce potatoes as we fill up, just as kind of like making roots. And the real cool thing about growing potatoes, especially in containers, is as a gardener, you're about the only one that can get what are called new potatoes. And so new potatoes are littler. They're on the sides there. The skins haven't hardened up yet. And so you're always anxious to get potatoes. When potato plant starts to flower, that means that it's putting on potatoes. And a couple weeks after I see flowers, I'll kind of dig down in the edges and pull up some of these new potatoes. And oh, I'm telling you, cut those up with that real soft, thin skin. Bake those up, and there's just nothing like it. There are when you go to the nursery, there'll be at least 3 different types of potatoes, but some nurseries will have a lot more than that. There are little fingerlings that just have wonderful, intense flavors. Again, it's part of the fun of gardening is searching these things out and seeing what you can find that might be a little bit different. And again, that's about growing in containers. You can have 2 or 3 containers and just buy a couple different seed potatoes of each one. See which one you like the best. And just super easy to grow. Like we talked about last week, and I've been talking about it everywhere I go. You know, I get these radio people are calling, they want to know about gardening. It's all about what you grow these plants in. And so when you have a container and it's filled up with good planting mix, you have a really great shot at being having a great green thumb and being very successful, because again, you're the one you're controlling the water and the fertilization. And you could do something like radishes. Let's see, I got root crops in here. Oh, next. Good. Radishes, carrots. Look at those beets. That's from 1 packet of beets. Another question from Deborah Lee. Can you use organic potting soil purchased last year or 2 years ago? Sure, no problem. Doesn't go bad. I'm glad you're using organic, as I do a radio show called The Organic Gardener. But I'm not getting on a soapbox. I'm just telling you that's how I do it. You can garden any way you'd like to garden. Okay. You know, with my containers too, I get this question a lot. You know, do you dump the whole container out every year? And never. I couldn't afford to do it that way. Usually, the container on its own, after a year, it kind of sinks down from the top, and you got 6 to 8 inches there. Now, I might pull out about a third of it and somewhere else, use it to grow potatoes in, something like that, and then add a little bit more on the top. You should make your radio show into a podcast. Guess what, Deborah Lee? It is a podcast too. Since it's on at 7 in the morning on Sundays, not everyone can see it. So after I air it live on KDKA on Sunday mornings at 7, then a producer puts it out there as a podcast. And you know what? Maybe I shouldn't tell you this, but you get to listen to it commercial free when it's the podcast. But live, you can call in. So let's talk a little bit about root crops. Man, radishes, and I talked about planting radishes and carrots together last week, but in a container for kids, this is the perfect mixture where you're taking a packet of carrots and a packet of radishes, and you're just throwing both of them into this container, and I would say a 10-gallon container. Root crops love containers because you got that soft soil in there, and they can make that root. They can make that deep carrot without having to push through rocks and clay and shale. And so the idea is, if you weren't here for last week, I'll just tell you real quick. We put those seeds together. The radishes come up first. We're thinning. Every root crop has to be thinned so that it makes a nice sized root. Well, the thinnings are what we call microgreens, and they are to die for. I just was having fun a couple days ago working in the garden. I was thinning out this stuff called tatsoi, which I think I talked a little bit about last week. And I'm certainly going to talk about next week when we talk about different weird plants that I love to grow. But yeah, thinning that stuff out. The radishes are done in 30 days. That's one of the things that makes them great for kids. You know, they get to see it sprout in 2 days. They can pick them in 30 days. And once the radishes are out, you're leaving room for the carrots. But I wanted to talk about these beets. I was a beet hater, but I'm a beet lover now. And that is just out of 1 packet of mixed beets called Colorful Beet Mixture. The one that has the stripes, the white flesh with pink stripes, that's called Chioggia. It's named after an Italian fishing village in Italy. It's an heirloom from the late 1800s. And I'm telling you, when you grow a beet like that and you cut it open, and again, for kids, they're going to look at that like and see that target, and it's just amazing. But each one of those beets has a little bit different flavor. And so that's why we grow the different ones. I love golden beets and I love Chioggia and I certainly love deep red ones. And the white ones are great too. They're mild. So the question is best place to purchase organic plants. You'll have to look around a little bit. There is a place that I love. I'm going to type that up here. Place I love called Garden Dreams. It's in Wilkinsburg, and it's definitely all organic plants. Now, someone else took them over, Grow Pittsburgh, which is a great organization. So I'm not sure about their hours and when they're open, and they're just getting started again. But poke around a little bit at nurseries, and most nurseries nowadays will offer organic plants. And even if when you get them nowadays, spell that right. If you get them before that, you can then grow them organically if you want. And so a lot of times that's what I'll do. I can't find all organic transplants. Most of what I grow from seed myself. And so I know they're organic. But once I get the transplant and I put it in, now it's growing in organic soil. It's growing with organic inputs and no chemicals at all. I'll be talking about that in an upcoming class. Here's another idea for your containers, especially for easy. If you've never done this before and you want something that's almost foolproof, uh, you can extend the season by putting a pot in with plants of lettuce and also seeds. And so your plants will be ready real quick. You'll be harvesting within weeks, especially when things warm up. And when they're done, what'll come up will be the ones from the seed, and then you'll have a longer harvest. One thing to remember about a lot of these cool weather crops is that you're going to have to keep planting them through the season. I do at least 8 crops of lettuce a season. And when we get into the summer, lettuce it hates hot weather, and I'm choosing a variety. Let me type that in here. I'm choosing a variety I love for hot weather. When it gets hot, I look for a lettuce called Simpson Elite. Last week we talked, about black-seeded Simpson. And black-seeded Simpson is the most popular lettuce out there, but Simpson Elite will go another 30 days out in the field. It'll do hot weather, but so right now they can be out in the open. They love this cool weather. They're going nuts. But when we get to mid-June, July, August, I'm throwing those seeds like under plants, in beds under plants, and just making a little carpet of lettuce where they're getting a little shade to keep them cool so they don't bolt right away. Some of those 8 crops that I'm growing don't last long, where if the weather's wrong and they get hot and they bolt, well, then I just plant some more seeds after that. Lettuce seeds are inexpensive, and you can see there's hundreds in each packet. Okay, let's talk a little bit about raised beds before we're done. So raised beds are actually a type of container. I got another picture here. And you can see that it's a big container, but it makes the garden accessible to people that wouldn't be able to garden, but it also, things warm up quicker, things dry out a little quicker. But when you fill that raised bed with good soil, you can grow anything in there you would like to, and it's going to go nuts. I have another question. What size container for lettuce? Just about any container will work. I'll go up to this picture up at the front real quick. See that watering can there? That's only 10 inches around on top. And look at how that stuff's going. And since I took this picture about a week and a half ago, they've doubled their size. Again, I'm feeding them that organic grow stuff. I need to get out there and harvest because I'm gonna snip those down. They'll come back again, and I'll snip them again, and maybe one more time if the weather cooperates. Let's go back to our raised beds. Hope you guys are having fun for this. I'm having fun doing these. I'm growing all in raised beds. Mine aren't above the ground like that. Mine are just start at the ground and come up from there, and are only a few feet deep. Oh, good. I'm glad you're having fun. Yes, that old watering can. That's another question. Does that old watering can have a hole in the bottom? Yes, that watering can was drilled. I'm not much of a handyman. I don't know what side of a hammer to hold, but I can drill a hole in the bottom of a watering can. If you don't, a lot of people, you couldn't build a raised bed like this, but if you just dumped compost on top of your garden, that would be a raised bed. And if you put wood around it, and I use rough cut cedar because it's safe, it's cheap, and it's rot resistant, that is a container. That becomes a container. And so it doesn't have to be a 10-inch, it could be a 3 foot by 4 foot container. So the sky is the limit, and it's about what you want to grow in. It's about what you want to grow, and it's about experimenting. And I see we're getting lots of comments there. Good, fun, and very useful. That's what I want to say. Have fun with your containers. You know, when you're experimenting with containers, you might find that you picked too small of a container, or you had room in there. And so, in the case of a too small container, you just take that plant and you pot it up to a bigger one. When there's some space left in there, and say, well, this plant isn't going to take all that space, it gives you room to plant something else. Uh, we're all at home a little bit more now. And as I said at the beginning, I'm getting more garden jobs done than you could possibly imagine. And it feels good to be out in the garden. I just did a PSA for an organization, and I was talking about how you get solace from being in the garden and from working with your containers, from working with your vegetables. And one thing, it just takes your mind off everything that's going on out there. I'm talk to gardeners every day that are trying to make sense of it and are using their garden as a place just to sit and think about something else, to watch the birds, to watch the rabbits, to watch the deer. As long as they're not eating my stuff, I'm happy watching them. All right, let's talk about next week. And if you've got some more questions too, we can do the last 10 minutes of questions. It doesn't even have to be all about containers. We can talk anything that you would like to talk about gardening. But next week, I am very excited about next week because one of the things I'd love to do more than anything is grow different stuff. So down in that purple plant down there on the left, this is the first year I've grown this. I found the seeds from Kitchen Garden Seeds online. It's called purple tatsoi. And I talked about tatsoi last year. It's from the kale family, the same family as kale. And it's a very, very mild green, very easy to grow, loves cool weather. Excuse me. Up in the right-hand corner it's a seedling of a mustard green called Frizzy Lizzy. And boy, just from looking at the color of that seedling, I'm going to be excited to grow for this. There's my golden beets. And some of you might have seen this tomato before. I gave it away a couple years ago at the home show, called Heart of Italy. And it is beautiful. So here's a question from Deborah. When to plant the hotter plants? Tomatoes, peppers, potatoes. Potatoes can go in right now, but tomatoes, peppers, and beans. Let me answer that in the chat. Warm season crops are often planted around the third week of May. But I have some secrets that I'm doing in one of the classes coming up in early May to help you get those early plants or those warm loving plants in early, which is something we all strive for. The third week of May, send that. Okay, another question. Planting lots of dill, your recommendations? Yes. Anyone who grows dill knows, and I'm typing this, so bear with me. Dill knows, once you have dill, you'll always have dill because it goes to seed like crazy. There's a dill called, I think it's just called Mammoth, that I like. But the wonderful thing about dill that people don't know is Organic Gardening Magazine did a story years and years ago looking at all the different plants that bring in the good bugs, our pollinators, our parasitic wasps, and don't be afraid of that word wasps. It can't hurt us. It's so, some of them are so small they can lay an egg on an aphid. But dill is the number one plant for bringing in the good bugs, so everyone should be growing it. I do grow one. I'm not sure if it's called Mammoth or Mammoth Dill, but it's a big one, and you know, 6, 8 feet tall and smells wonderful. And again, a great pollinator plant. And if you find something else out there, give it a shot. Put it in the ground, and there's always there's always a corner. There's always a part of a container. There's always an area that you can squeeze something else into. And again, that's one of the fun things about what we do. How about some more? Okay, can we plant dill in partly shade? Sure. Dill loves full sun. Whoops, loves. I'm typing again. That's why it's taking so long. You know, I imagine I'm a professional writer. I keep. I don't have any spell check on this. Dill loves full sun, but will grow just about anywhere. The more sun, the better. Any other questions before we go? We still have some time. For me, I love what happened to me today was I did a Zoom for the station is 100.7. I think it's called Wish. And the DJ was doing it from home. And you know, it's a young couple, and her husband had just started their first garden. And boy, he had questions, and it was great. So, another question Bill has about there's two different types of fennel. One doesn't make the big bulb, the other one does. And so finding them at the nursery, you just have to ask, like, is this for making the bulb or is this just for making ferny foliage? Because oftentimes the fennel that's just the ferny foliage are very similar to dill. But that bulb, oh, it's to die for. Excuse me. And you just need to find the right one in a nursery, and you can find both types. How about another question? Let's talk gardening while we're here. This is fun. Oh yeah, this is the perfect time to plant onions. 3 ways to do it. Get this typed out. And they're good, all good for containers. The easiest way to do it probably is to find the sets at your local nursery. They're just like little miniature onions, but my friend Jessica Walliser did some research and found that the smaller sets make bigger onions. Isn't that cool? Because, you know, whenever I went to buy onion sets, I would always call out the small ones and get the big ones. But for some reason, the littler ones actually work better than the big sets. And you can also, I saw some at Best Feeds the other day, you can also start from plants. Plants are usually sold in packs of 75. And so you might split them with a friend, but plants are a great way to grow onions. The trick for onions is full sun, you know. And if you, in the other way, the third way is from seed, and onion seed must be fresh. You can't use seed that's 2 or 3 years old. It usually doesn't germinate. And I grow bunching onions that way. I've got some bunching onions out in the garden now that I need to do some thinning on, and I got some in the greenhouse too. But for instant growth, plants or sets, whatever you can get a hold of, uh, are are easy to plant and should be planted right now. Just one word of warning, and I'll probably say this at every webinar: be sure your soil is able to be worked. That means that if you get that shovel and you turn it over and it doesn't just fall off, it sticks on there, it's too wet. In those cases, we're planting in containers, or we're just throwing compost on top instead of digging the bed and planting in that. And don't turn the soil over if it's too wet. We're going to have a lot of rain here, so that shovel test works great. Another question before we go, or do we want to call it a day? I see someone just left the meeting, but I'll stay here all day if you have questions. I'm happy to do it. Oh, have I ever used pit moss? Yes, yes, yes. That's all I'm growing in. Typing again. I love that stuff, and let me explain what it is. It's made locally in Ambridge. They were on that show Shark Tank. It's made out of recycled newspapers. It's lightweight. There's different versions of pit moss. Some of it has organic fertilizer in it. There's one called Pit Moss Plentiful, Pit Moss Premium. And the one key to it, and it's great for containers because it's lightweight and it uses 2/3 less water, made out of recycled newspapers. You can't go wrong with that stuff. I just love it. Okay, any herbs for part shade? Herbs will take, most herbs will take part shade. You have to experiment. We always say right plant for the right place, but all I got is part shade. So I'm growing basil. I'm growing all sorts of herbs. Shade, I'm going to answer that question. Oh, Lucinda, this is great. Her comment is, I just bought pit moss for delivery. Prices online are at deep discount right now, and they're giving 3 seed packets with each order. Well, that's awesome. Because like I said, I love that stuff. I think it's great. There was another question up there. Oh, best sunflowers for containers. I don't even know if I know the answer to that. Or containers would be a short, stocky one, but I can't come up with a name. You're gonna have to go to the nursery, look through the seeds, and see one you'll see one there. It'll say, short and stocky or for the container. Can't come up with a name. I could get online and find you something. If you send me an email, I'll figure out a good sunflower for you, and I'll post my email here. Email me it's Doug Oster at Comcast.net. I answer all my questions. If you don't get an answer, that means I didn't get your question. Yeah, I like Gardener Supply. Worked for them about 30 years ago. Did some pictures for one of their catalogs. It's good stuff. I'm interested to see how fast the stuff goes at the store. People are going crazy for gardening this year, and I'm trying to help them the best I can. Improve the soil. Choose the right plant for the right time, and don't let it dry out, and you will be a great gardener. If you have another question, please send it. If not, we'll finish up here. A couple people have left the meeting. I don't want to keep you here longer than you want to be here, but I'm always happy to answer any question you have. Thank you, Lucinda. Thank you, Deborah Lee. Thank you for coming. Sure appreciate it. I hope you can come next week. Thank you, Craig. That's nice of you to say. Craig, I know you want to see the last weeks, and we're going to take care of you there. I enjoyed doing this with you. We'll be back next week. And boy, wait till you see all the weird plants that I'm going to tell you about. And maybe you'll be a convert into the weird plants. I'm going to take this keynote down if I can figure out how to do it. Stop sharing. And can you see me? Okay, good, good, good. I still have my chat up. I guess we're about an hour in. We should probably finish up. again, if you have any other questions at all, feel free to send me an email. I'll do everything I can to help you. We just we're going to have a great season, and we got to do it safely. I can't stress that enough. At 60 years of age, I do not want to get this. I have to go out. I have to go to these nurseries sometimes, but I'm telling you, I'm taking every precaution. I'm wearing the mask. I'm wearing gloves. I'm staying away from people. I want it curbside. Uh, it's no sense in risking anything. How when this goes away, when we get back to some set of normalcy, it'll be great. But use that garden as a place to think about other things. That's what I'm doing. All right, I think we're going to call it, guys. And thank you very much for being part of this. I can't wait to see you next week. Again, any other questions, send me an email and we'll help you out. Have a great day today. I've got one more of these to give later. I'm doing my first virtual garden club talk later today, so that should be interesting. And I've warmed up on you guys, and we'll do them next. Thanks, everybody.